"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all?" And the mirror replied, "You, my queen, may lovely be, but Snow White is fairer still than thee." The queen was very angry. She could not stand to have anybody be prettier than herself. She called a woodsman and ordered him to take Snow White away and to kill her. Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. The topic for today's show is fairy tales. Query: do fairy tales send young girls the wrong message? Are fairy tales excessively and offensively violent? Specifically, how does the murder, the torture, and the cruelty found in so many fairy tales affect the children who hear them? Why the prevalence of the evil stepmother? Who and what exactly does the ever-present witch embody? And why must she always die? Joining me for this discussion, Sheldon Cashton, a professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is the author of a wonderful book entitled The Witch Must Die. Welcome, Sheldon.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Dr. Larry Larson, child psychologist and author. Dr. Larson, once again, delighted you could join us. And Maria Tatar holds a Harvard College professorship. She's the author of Classic Fairy Tales, The Hard Facts of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, and Off with Their Heads, Fairy Tales and the Culture of Childhood. Maria, thanks for joining us. And I am Diane Sullivan, a professor at MSL. Maria, do traditional fairy tales send young girls the wrong message that they should wait for Prince Charming, even if that's 100 years?
Well, I don't think they send messages. What they do is they raise issues. Fairy tales are always up close and personal. They deal with sibling rivalry, family conflicts, romance, riches, all the issues that are burning issues, not only for children, but for all of us.
In Cinderella, all Cinderella has to do to find, quote, the perfect man is to be the most beautiful, have the right shoe size, and have beautiful clothes.
And work.
And work. Okay,
Work
that's
hard.
good. Yeah, that's a fair point. But I wonder, is this the message that we want to instill in our children? Dr. Larson.
I think you're missing the point of Cinderella. The first person that I meet in Cinderella is, or first people I meet are the abusive family.
And I want to get to that.
And the other stepsisters who are giving her a rough time. I think Cinderella is nothing but the ancient story of Pygmalion, which is being revisited and reshaped. I also would like to start, perhaps Sheldon would have something to say about this, but the Swiss psychiatrist Jung raised the whole issue. Where does myth come from? Where do fairy tales ultimately derive? They're nothing but stories, and stories are repositories of human experience. So fairy tales, which are read and understood by children, are not unfamiliar to them as themes of sibship, families, interpersonal struggles, good and evil, with which we all must deal in one way or another. And I think they're really quite beautiful.
But you know, as a young girl, my mom read me fairy tales. And I truly believed that there was Prince Charming. I truly believed if you kissed the frog.
Did you ever get help for that? No, I'm sorry.
I have an appointment with you on Monday morning. Okay, maybe after all these years, we can solve this problem. Sheldon, your reaction.
Well, I agree with Dr. Larson. I think that fairy tales do touch on primal themes. And my thinking about it is that you can't take the stories in a sense too literally, that their real impact is operating on an unconscious level. And the themes then, at least in my view, that they seem to touch on are things like greed, envy, and that's what Cinderella, I think, is essentially about. So I don't think it's really a matter of so much the prince satisfying, being a savior, so to speak, for the heroine, but really a story about a family in which envy is operating as a major dynamic. So when the child reads that, I think what is happening is that he or she responds to that element, and in the story helping resolve that issue, it helps resolve the issue for the child himself.
Maybe I do have problems, or maybe it's a gender issue, but for me, as a young girl, the story was always the same. In the end, Prince Charming would come rescue you from all your problems. And I wonder, wouldn't it be better to teach young girls that they they really can work this out for themselves. They don't have to look to a man to come to rescue them in
Well,
today's times.
In the early versions of Cinderella, Cinderella was actually the resourceful character. She wasn't passive at all. In fact, in the Disney version, she's not really passive either. She does a lot to rescue herself. I would say the fairy tales actually, though, do deal not just with emotions, emotional well-being, but also fantasy. And maybe your mother found that she wanted you to be reality-oriented, but I think maybe our fantasies and fears are really what are at stake in fairy tales. And there may be nothing wrong with having the fantasy as long as you know that this is somebody else's fantasy, not necessarily your own.
I know there's another issue here, and I'd be very interested to get both of your views as specialists in this field. It seems to me as if Cinderella is also a story about justice in a peculiar kind of way. And as a professor of law, you might be interested in this. Cinderella is actually being treated very unjustly. She's being abused, and the abuse is at the hands of her family. The Prince Charming is, I see, a somewhat incidental figure in the story. The actual twist is in the address to the injustice which had been done to her, and that indeed in this rather tragic or disadvantaged soul is a spirit of beauty and loveliness which emerges. I don't know, how do you feel about that?
Well, if you look at the story and touch on this justice thing, I think a lot of fairy tales do have that element of justice. Now, the grim version of the Cinderella story ends with the sisters having their eyes pecked out.
It is a great
There's
version.
justice.
Okay, and there's justice to it. But let me touch on
Retaliation.
on just another element in the story that's often overlooked, and it's overlooked in the Disney version of the story, but it's in the Grimm version, and I think it's very important. And in the Grimm version, when the father leaves to go on a trip, he asks the daughters what they want, and they want jewels and dresses. When he said when he asked Cinderella what she would like, she just asked for a twig, a hazel twig, the first twig that hits his cap. He brings it back to her, and she plants the twig, and then Maria will correct me on this to see if I have it correct. She plants a twig and then cries over it, and her tears nourish a tree. Now, the tree is a representation of the mother, and I think that is really the critical aspect of the story. I mean, a large part of it has to do with envy, but the other has to do with the notion of the mother, even though she's dead, still caring for the child. Okay, she symbolically rises up as a tree. There are doves in the tree also that become Cinderella's protectors. So I think the message, a very important message, is that there's a maternal force that lives within you that will always take care of you. And I think that's a very powerful message, for children.
That leads me to another question. Let me ask you experts. Why is there always, or almost always, an evil stepmother? In all of these fairy tales, women are the agents of evil, and there's generally, if not always, an evil stepmother. Why is that?
Women are the ones who raise children in our culture and in many other cultures as well. So women are the powerful figures, and so that you find that they are demonized in many cases, and they play a large role in the tales. Sometimes they're presented as benevolent, as you just pointed out, but then they're dead.
But usually that's
So
the
often.
biological mother who's benevolent,
and that's-
never the stepmother.
That's a good mother.
But there is this splitting.
Right, and I think at a very basic level, these are stories about good and evil, and you need an evil character in the story.
But why always a woman?
Well, I think that bears back on what you're saying. I think the women were have traditionally been the caretakers. They are the primary figure in the infant's life, in the young child's life, and mothers have good and bad elements within them. And I think what happens is that they get split. They get both internalized and split in the child's mind, so that it becomes a good mother and a bad mother, symbolically. I think the fairy tales allow the child to project that out into a real drama, and then the child is able to kind of work out this drama between good and bad. But you do need a bad character, just like in Star Wars, you need Darth Vader. What would Star Wars be without Darth Vader? It would just be another.
Every story has to have melodrama.
Well,
right?
there's a melodrama.
Yeah.
It's really,
Yeah.
it's really badness. It's evil. Even in Harry
Good
Potter,
versus evil.
even in Harry Potter, you have this. I only read the first book, but still, this character called Voldemort is a prominent character in the book because he's killed Harry Potter's parents, and he's the Darth Vader of the story. And I'm sure that at the end of the 7 novels, he will have his comeuppance. But you need that character in all these stories.
But I think what you're saying about the stepmother is very true, Sheldon, that really it's a representation of the two sides of perhaps all mothers. That a child experiences mother sometimes in a very warm and nurturing way, and sometimes mother is a witch. Mm-hmm. And this could be true for all of us if we describe our experience. The other question I sort of had that was touching me here: who is the hero in these stories?
Always
Cinderella, for instance, isn't it always the child?
Yeah.
Always a child, but also always a victim, which gets us back to your notion of justice. So that these are stories that require some sort of retaliation and revenge. Not that is, justice comes in the form of revenge, because the child has been victimized by these forces of evil. Victimized, and then also so often an orphan, like Harry Potter.
Since you're talking about Harry Potter, what accounts for the present popularity, do you think, of the Harry Potter books?
My view, they would know more about this from the specialist standpoint, but my view, among the kids that I see who adore Harry Potter, is the fact that he tunes into their sense of smallness and their fantasies and desires to be powerful, to be omnipotent, to be omniscient. We all long to be wizards, and Harry Potter has so wonderfully addressed that in the lives of kids.
And sort of to get even again, there's that sense of retaliation. What I found is, I find it difficult to get excited about these books. For some reason, it's not my genre. But what is wonderful is to talk to people about Harry Potter. That is, it seems to me those books are building a community of readers. We ask each other, why do you like the stories? What is it about the story? How did you react to it? And that's the real power of storytelling,
but
is that it gets us talking to each other.
Isn't Harry Potter really a classic fairy tale? I mean, it has.
Absolutely.
I mean, he lives underneath the steps. Okay, he's like Cinderella.
Right.
He has parents or kind of quasi step parents, the Muggles, who treat him like dirt.
Right.
And then he crosses over into the other world, just like the character in fairy tales. He goes off to Hogwarts.
A real fantasy world.
A real fantasy
right.
world.
Right.
And you have this witch character, this Voldemort. And I think all the books basically involve the struggle between Harry and this character. I was going to just add one other element that I think adds to the popularity of the book, is that it takes place in a school setting.
Exactly.
And kids relate to that. He goes off, and not only is there the relationship to the teachers, but all these different sub-schools within Hogwarts who are competing against one another. So it touches into the child's reality.
He's a survivor. The big difference with fairy tales, I think, is that Potter has magical powers. And if you look at most fairy tale figures, they don't have the power of magic. They do it on their own. They use their wits, they use their resources to get what they want.
So in a way, it fits more into a child's wish fulfillment to have that power.
Which may account for the power, yes.
The power of the
power.
power.
Right, the power of the power. The force.
Why are some of the parents denouncing the Harry Potter books as being very dangerous?
Oh, I'm so glad some parents are doing that, just because any good book is going to provoke controversy. I mean, look at any great children's book, and there's always been some sort of storm of protest. I mean, in this case, I think it's just been about the connection with witchcraft.
Right. But I was saying to Diane, you had the same reaction to the Grimm tales by parents in the 1800s. They felt that was going to corrupt children, and now you have this the wheel coming around with parents again feeling that somehow this story is going to corrupt their child.
Well, one thing I do want to talk about is, to me, I think fairy tales are offensively violent. I believe that. I know.
I don't.
I know.
I don't.
Me again.
No, I don't.
Every day next week. And why is the violence that's contained in so many fairy tales a necessary ingredient? Even in Harry Potter, I read the first chapter of the new book, and there are 3 or 4 dead people with their eyes open. I mean, why do we need to read that? I mean, to me, that's frightening.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but well, let me just say, on one level, in a way, in the context of the world that we live in, it's really not that violent. I mean, kids watch terrible things on TV. They see slasher movies. Nintendo games are full of much more violence than the news, right? Much more violent than fairy tales. But as I said to you earlier, Diane, I think the violence is necessary. I think you have to have. I mean, what a fairy tale basically does is pit good against evil, and you don't talk evil out of being evil. You don't sit down and say to Hitler or Stalin or whatever, look, let's moderate your behavior and so on. Evil has to be dealt with in a forceful way.
Yeah.
And especially for a child who thinks in terms of absolute, I think you need a violent solution to violence. But the other thing is that the violence isn't gratuitous as it is in movies nowadays. I mean, the people who are punished in the stories, the witch or the evil stepmother or whatever, have committed evil acts. So
The violence is never glamorized.
Right, it's
sometimes it's presented in ways that make it humorous. I mean, kids often, I've never figured this out, why they always laugh when someone is decapitated. I mean, it's not ha-ha laughter, but clearly they're discharging their own anxieties in that sense. But, we don't want to read them stories like The Little Engine That Could. Or
but
cheerful
I think that's
stories
the
that are
leading
just
example of a great book to read children. I mean, I was
Yeah,
traumatized
that's-
by Hansel and Gretel and The Wizard of Oz. I truly was. And I wonder, why not keep Dr. Larson children as innocent as possible for as long as possible? What's the matter with that? 3-year-olds, do they need this type of violence?
I don't think that children are as innocent as we like to think. I think that if you listen to the dream work of children, if you listen to them talk about the world as they experience it, the forces that are at work in their lives are indeed good and evil, and there is a justice issue. And this violence is in service to that.
Your reaction, Sheldon?
I agree. I mean, I think that if you look at the stories in a sense as having a mythic quality to them, you're dealing with very very forceful forces, forces that require a forceful response.
Exactly.
And I think that at some level, it teaches children that there are certain things that cannot be put up with. But again, I shouldn't say it teaches children that, because I really don't think the fairy tales, I agree with, maybe it teach them. I think they absorb this at another level.
it shows them how to cope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how does the terror that's contained in fairy tales impact the children that hear them? Dr. Larson, it doesn't impact them at all?
I don't feel that it causes, in most children, any great harm. I've never seen that. In fact, if anything, I think it's a form of discharge. It really is more articulation of what's happening within them already. I see it as more representative than causal.
Is there any intrinsic value to exposing young children, at least in theory, to horror, fright, and even death?
Only with adults present. I mean, death is going to be a part of their life even at age 2. They may have a grandparent die or someone in the neighborhood. And then I think the parental role is really important. That is, telling the story about death or about violence is a very safe way of experiencing the violence, and then understanding how one can cope with it later in life.
My mother told me that I was the first in the family, and when she read me fairy tales, she read them as they were written. But then with my subsequent siblings, she said, my gosh, what am I reading my children? So in Hansel and Gretel, people were not cooked in the oven and so forth. So could not we rewrite the fairy tales in such a way that we eliminate some of the gruesome, the cannibalism?
Well, they are. I mean, Disney did. So they have been rewritten, and I've picked up a book in Barnes and Nobles, and you look at them and you say, where what happened to this in the story? What happened to that in the story? They're being rewritten all the time. I think the question that I raise is whether that does a disservice to children, whether watering down the fairy tales really
And does
takes
it?
I think it does.
I think it does.
Yeah.
I remember some years ago when I was in training, as part of my training, they put me in a preschool nursery, a particular supervisor that I had. I spent time working with these preschool kids, which was something I'll never forget. In the course of one day, we found a dead bird. We were out playing in a sandbox or whatever. And the children found the dead bird. They wanted to bury the dead bird. We had a funeral for the dead bird. The next day, they wanted to dig it up to see if the dead bird were in fact alive, was it still there, or had some magic intervened. And they dealt with the reality of the fact that the bird was still there. And we exhumed and reburied the bird, I think, about 3 times before that whole issue was put to rest. And that was, if you will, a living fairy tale. It was working through something. And I think children do that as they listen to these stories.
You know, you brought up something, Sheldon, that I think is interesting. I do recall in Pinocchio, the original version, Pinocchio lied because he had no conscience. In the Disney version, he lies because others force him, other villains force him into bad behavior. So I think you're right to say, well, there's a concern if Disney takes out some of the elements of a fairy tale that would get a young child to recognize, hey, I have blameworthiness. But absent those type of messages, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have some of the more frightening elements in a fairy tale that we read to 3- and 4-year-olds?
So you're talking about a politically correct fairy tale.
I guess I am.
Well, there are other ways of rewriting. I mean, think about Gerber, who took Little Red Riding Hood and turned her into a pistol-toting girl who pulls the revolver out of her basket, shoots the wolf. And the moral of that story, Thurber tells us, is it's not so easy to fool little girls these days. So, you know, I do want to put in a word for rewriting because although these stories are connected with myth and they have the power of myth, they're not sacred stories.
No, they're not.
Myths, of course, like Pygmalion, have been rewritten
All
again
the
and
time.
again. And so we should, you know, some of our rewrites will be PC, and there are kids who will like that and who will thrive when they're read a PC version of a fairy tale, one in which compassion is stressed. Nothing wrong with that. But there are some kids who will find they need humor and they need the violence and they need to think about death. They want to sort of work through the anxieties that you were talking about.
Dr. Lawson, if you could rewrite fairy tales,
Uh-oh.
what would a good fairy tale be? What message would you wish to instill in young children?
I'm not sure that I really want to rewrite fairy tales.
I was trying to, you know, use my legal skills and
yeah,
get
you were
there.
you were inching me over. No, I really think I like them the way they are, and I do like the themes of justice and the easing of the tension that builds when wrong is continually unaddressed and something must eventually occur. I do think, I completely agree with Maria, that rewriting is necessary because civilization changes. The ancient story is the main thread, but the embellishment, the embodiment of it, the symbolization of it is reworked all the time by our human experience, and that's what makes myths so absolutely wonderful.
But parents are the gateway, so to speak, to fairy tales for very young children, and I think that it behooves us to kind of be aware that some of the stories are not as rich and it's not as useful as they could be. I think that the Disney Snow White is a delightful story, and it visualizes a fairy tale in a way that a book cannot. But when you really get down to it, it really cuts out some very important parts of the fairy tale, I think. I think that fairy tale essentially has to do with vanity, in which the evil...
Very good point.
The evil stepmother saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And that drives the story. Now, in the original, or the Grimm version, the witch makes or the stepmother makes 3 visits as a disguised hag to Snow White's cottage. And the first one, she gains entry to the cottage by selling her on buying stay laces, or the laces that girls used to lace up their bosom. The second time, she and as a function of that, she almost dies because she squeezes the breath out of her. The dwarfs come in to save her at the last moment. She comes in a second time, and she visits a second time, gives her a comb, and the comb has poison in it. And it's only because the dwarfs come and save her a second time that she's revived. Well, that's out of the, that was cut out of the Disney version. And I think that's important because it indicates that Snow White herself harbors some of the same negative inclinations as the evil stepmother. She too wants to be pretty, and she doesn't listen to the dwarfs, and that gets her into difficulty. So I think that message is diluted by Disney, even though I can't argue that Disney's stories were very
If you think
beneficial.
about it, there really is no original version to refer back. We often think the Grimm's stories are the classic fairy tales. But in fact, all the Grimm's did was to record different versions of the stories. So
Right.
what we have are variants. We only have rewrites anyway. We don't have an original to refer
But don't you
back
think that
to.
if parents are aware of the different versions, that they can, I mean, why should a parent take the latest version off the shelf in Barnes & Noble and say that's a good version? I think I agree with you. There are different versions of fairy tales, some of which are better than others. Like I personally think the Disney version of The Little Mermaid is more of a fairy tale than the Anderson version, and I like that version because it has a witch and it has a battle in the end between good and evil, and good vanquishes evil. Now that doesn't happen in the Little Mermaid, an Anderson story, in which the Little Mermaid dies at the end. So
Anderson's like very, very weak tea
Right,
compared
right.
with Disney. Disney
Right.
makes it a really powerful
in that
story.
case, and that's
Yeah,
why
yeah.
as a parent, I would rather have that story
Than the other one.
than the other one.
You brought up something interesting. You mentioned what I think is the preoccupation with looks in some of these fairy tales. Are we setting up, why is that so, I guess, is my first question. And my second question would be, are we setting up an impossible ideal for our little girls to achieve?
Think about beauty and fairness. Fairness and the theme of justice. In fairy tales, beauty equals virtue. And that is problematic, no doubt about it. If someone is unattractive and ugly, they're also evil. So I think that's something we need to be aware of as parents as we're reading these stories to children and with children. And if there's any problem that I have with fairy tales, it probably is the aesthetic issue.
But wouldn't you say that you could address that issue of beauty and its place in one's life with a classic story like Vicky with the Tuft, where you have the prince who's very ugly and two sisters, one of whom is very ugly and the other one who is very intelligent. And the story plays out as to who, what is more important. And in fact, in that story, it's the princess who is ugly but more intelligent who is the one who is valued. And I think that the message there is a very positive one because children are always concerned about their looks and who's pretty and who's going to be the prom queen or whatever. So if you have a story like that, I think it could raise very potent issues for children and be worked out in the context of a parent-child conversation.
And there are many feminist rewrites of fairy tales which do precisely what you've described. Jane Yolen's Sleeping Ugly, for
Right.
example, has a new type of protagonist.
Different question, totally. Do fairy tales in any way teach children to disrespect authority?
I think that they grow out of children's problems with authority from time to time. I think that the Harry Potter, at least part of that, is relieving some of the tedium that I think children often feel within the school setting, and the fact that you who think you are so great really are not, because greatness is hidden under the stairs and in this little boy. I think that's the message that I tend to get, is that the weak can be powerful. That which is ignored really has the grace and the wisdom.
That's a great comment. We're quickly out of time on this segment of the show, so I'm going to ask our viewers to stay tuned. And when we come back from the break, we'll take a look at an interview I did earlier with two young mothers about the use of fairy tales in their lives with their children. So please stay tuned. Thank you.
Hello?
Hi, honey. What are you doing?
Doing homework with my friends. Aren't I supposed to?
Just called to say hi, that's all.
Hi? That's all?
Yep.
Dad, that's so cool.
But hey, coolness runs in our family.
Well, I was thinking that I need my allowance a little early.
What a coincidence. I need someone to clean the garage for me.
Really?
Family.
I'll see you tonight, Dad.
Isn't it about
All right.
time?
I love you.
I love you too, Dad.
From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You know, I was there when Dr. King shared his dream with the world.
I have a dream today.
And I was there when we launched men to the moon. I was even there when Mark McGuire broke the home run record. Yep, I've seen a lot in my day. Thanks to television, of course.
Before you know it, she talks. Before you know it, she walks. Before you know it, she knows you. Before you know it, she has a heart. Before you know you're pregnant, when your baby's no bigger than a grain of rice, before she's a twinkle in your eye, that's when you need to take folic acid every day. After that, it's too late to prevent some serious birth defects. Folic acid now, before you know it.
Laurie, did your mother read you fairy tales?
Yes, she did. The typical stories like Snow White, Cinderella, things like that.
In retrospect, do you believe that was a good thing?
I do think it was a good thing. I would hesitate to build those type of fantasies into everyday life, but I think some element of it is a good thing for children.
Did you marry Prince Charming?
I did.
So your husband measured up?
He did. He did. I got lucky. I did.
And do you read your daughters fairy tales now?
I do. I try to be careful of the stories that we select, though, because they've reached an age now where they're understanding about death and things like that, so they're more sensitive to things like that. So I try to stay away from stories that contain deaths with the parent or things like that.
So the violence and the abandonment of the children, those type of issues concern you?
They do. I didn't really realize it until actually we were watching a video, and I watched their response to it and noticed that they were troubled by it, and that's when I first really became aware of it.
Rosa, do you read your children fairy tales?
Yes, I do, every night. Actually, my older son reads to her sometimes too, fairy tales.
Do you believe that fairy tales are good for children?
I believe that they are. There's nothing wrong with reading to the kids stories that are make-believe. They're small, so to them, they believe what they hear, and I think it's harmless to read it to them.
Does the violence in fairy tales concern you in any way?
I really try not to read any violent fairy tales. For example, Hansel and Gretel, I've never read that one. Because she's a girl, I try to stick with Cinderella, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast. Even though the Beast may be a little scary, she seems to enjoy the pictures. So, no, I don't really read violent fairy tales to her.
Welcome back to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. We're here discussing fairy tales and the impact on children. What is your reaction, Maria, to the interviews?
I thought it was wonderful that one of the mothers talked about watching her children respond to the fairy tale. She observed the children. She saw that it was too much for them. It was more than they could handle. And she understood that, it was okay to back off, that one didn't have to necessarily read that story.
Dr. Laza?
First of all, I was pleased that both of the mothers were in fact using fairy tales or reading fairy tales. And suddenly dawned on me, what we're talking here about is a tradition. It goes back many years before. And certain fairy tales were read to them, their mothers, and to their mothers before them, and so on. So that they, as I think Maria was saying before the break, it becomes woven into the very fabric of life. I thought that touched me.
And just picking up on that, these notions, it's saying that fairy tales are an interactive event. You know, that they're a way for parents to interact with their children. It's so different than sticking a kid in front of a TV or sticking him in front of a computer screen or, you know, whatever, and saying, okay, I've taken care of the kid for this afternoon or whatever. So it really is, I think, a very healthy, you know, just the whole idea of storytelling, I think, is a very healthy phenomenon to the extent that it's coming back, and I think it is. I think that's a good sign.
I do agree with that. Let me ask you, kind of leads me to my next question, is whether fairy tales are losing their prevalence in modern life. Do you think this is an exception, these young women reading to their daughters, or do most families still read fairy tales?
You know, I always ask my students that question, whether they grew up with fairy tales or whether they're encountering fairy tales for the first time in their coursework. And I would say about half of them grew up with the stories. But the interesting thing is you discover when you ask about the story, everyone has a different story in their head. And often the details that they remember are very different from the details that other students remember, which means that those mothers who are reading the stories to their children, in a way they're constructing stories with the children. They're producing new stories. Even when they're reading from a book, they're producing a new story that is going to be carried on.
Sheldon, let me ask you a question, something you've written about. Why in most fairy tales is there a witch? Why is that witch female? And why in the end must she die?
Big question.
Yes.
I think what the witch represents is see, okay, starting from the beginning, psychologically speaking, I think children split the mother into two parts psychologically, because mothers have good qualities and mothers have bad qualities. The qualities aren't necessarily bad in a absolute way. It's just that the mother may not always be there when the child you know, is hungry or irritable or what have you. So the child, very young child, deals with the world with a maternal figure by splitting her. And I think what happens in fairy tales is that the witch, this gets projected into the story so that the witch takes on the character of the bad mother, and the child then has to somehow deal with that particular character, that particular figure in his or her life. Now, the fairy tale also is a way of children dealing with unacceptable impulses, like or unpleasant impulses like greed and vanity and deceit, telling lies, and the like. And what happens, I think, psychologically, is that the child projects those elements into the evil figure and destroys that evil figure. Not that the child destroys it, but the fairy tale destroys that evil figure, in a sense, destroying that negative part in the child. So it's a way of the child, in a way, acting out or playing out an inner drama. Now the thing is that fairy tales are fantasy, so they don't really work as such. I mean, they're like temporary fixes. And what the child then does is read the story again, or have the story read to him or her again. And each time that negative tendency is vanquished, the child feels better about himself. So I think this is why you have the witch in the story, the fact that mothers are the early caretakers of the child, make that figure female, and why that figure in the story has to be destroyed.
Can we go forward in this new century with men being witches also?
I think you can. I think there, not only in this century, but there were stories, other stories. One in my book, one that I talk about in my book, is called The Adroit Princess, and in that story, the witch figure is a male. And I think you can construct stories nowadays. And in fact, Darth Vader is a witch figure. Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter is a witch figure. So you are getting male figures into these stories.
Think about Jack and the Beanstalk. You have a giant who is presented as cannibalistic, wants to devour the kid. So, you know, I guess, do you think that represents the father in any way, the evil father? Is there that same splitting that takes place with fathers?
I would guess so, and I think that I'm not sure, but I wonder whether certain stories, see, early in life, it's the mother who is really the primary psychological figure for the child. And later on, the father usually enters the picture too and becomes an emotional figure for young children. I'm not sure, but I wonder whether stories with male figures as the evil character appeal more to older children. Because if you look at Harry Potter, it is a story, or it is a series of tales that appeal to kids who are 7, 8, 9. And if you look at Star Wars, those appeal to children who are older and able to go to the movies and so on. And I wonder whether that's an element in making the quote witch figure a male as opposed to a female.
I think there's a slightly different thing that I hear. I think that a witch figure, if you will, is a bit more intimate in the depiction in the fairy tale. The mother is a more intimate figure. The father, when you see a male figure, is usually somewhat removed, more awesome, more devastating, and will quite likely destroy you if you mess with this particular force or figure. And I think that, without trying to sound Oedipal all over again, I think that that's not uncommon in the way children perceive their parents. Mother, they may see her bad points. They may feel those witch-like qualities, if you will, but that's mother, and they can deal with her. They become very familiar with mother and how to deal with her. Father, on the other hand, when he explodes, just might do you in. And that's the fantasy, I think, that children often have about that. And I would suspect that those two gender issues might turn up in fairy tales and stories.
It was interesting to me, in recalling fairy tales, it always seemed to me that the father was never there when he was needed the most. He was always absent from the story. But that's my reaction there. There was never a father, it seemed. Like you only knew that the children had a father, but he was never there. He was always removed.
Or a very weak father, as in the case of Hansel and Gretel, where the father doesn't really mind that the stepmother is abandoning the children, which is a pretty scary thought.
They're maternal dramas, I think, at base level, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's one area where I think we could start to rewrite some of the stories, because social circumstances have changed, and some men are primary caretakers or appear earlier than they once did.
Let me ask you, Dr. Larson, do children identify the badness in the wolf with their own internal badness?
No, I don't think that they see it that way. I think that it's true, but I don't think that they see it that way. Symbolization happens in children without any particular cognitive intervention. In other words, they're unlikely to label particular things. Occasionally you'll meet a child who's amazingly perspicacious and a bit precocious and can do that, but that's more rare than not.
Let me open this question up to the panel. How important is fantasy, if at all, to a child's development? Do children need fantasy in their life?
Can I answer that with a quote that I just came across? It's in a book by Peter and Iona Opie, and in their preface they say, fairy tales give children a license to wonder, and a child who does not wonder is but an inlet for apple pie. And I think that captures. Right, I think that captures the essence of the fairy tale, or the wonder that a fairy tale has for children.
Absolutely, and that is the magic of childhood, their capacity for wonder. And in some ways, I think that we as adults are always trying to recapture that sense of wonder for ourselves, to repair our damaged sense of wonder. And in some ways, I think we can do it through, not just through these stories, but by reading these stories with children and seeing how they respond.
There's a slightly different bent I have on that. And that is that I think there's a great gender difference that evolves over time. I think fairy tales allow children access to an emotional life. And I think that what I see happening with boys as they turn into men is a closing off of their access to an emotional life. The ability to label emotions, the ability to sense them, to feel them, to deal with them, and so on. I would suspect that male children are deprived of fantasy at an earlier level, or move away from fantasy and into more overt physical play and other kinds of things. Some people would say, well, that's just in the wiring of males. I don't believe that's necessarily true. I think we stunt the growth of males in that regard. And that would be something I'd very much like to see boys and men recover. And I think fantasy life is one of the ways of doing that. Men who have that gift, I think, are extraordinary and are able to tell some very powerful stories that have enriched the world.
Well, one could argue that girls go from fairy tales to Danielle Steele and to men who never in their mind seem to measure up. I mean, so there can be harm in continuing the fairy tale.
But I would submit to you that girls and women, I think, are far more capable of accessing their emotional life.
Oh,
and it's one of the reasons I think men very much enjoy talking to women, is because they find it more difficult with their peers to admit and deal with that side of themselves.
To me, men's idea of talking with other men is they come over, they turn on a sports game, and they sit in silence.
And that's their fairy tale.
Yeah, I like that.
And we do use these stories to get in touch with ourselves and with each other. It's that wonderful tradition that you talked about. We saw these mothers reading to their children and using the story as a way to communicate and think about what they want in their lives.
So that argues in a way for using these stories with children, both male and female, at a very young age.
Which is a problem, though, because so many of the protagonists are female. I mean, do you think little boys identify with Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty?
No, I think that's
maybe we
an
need
issue. We need some male fairy tales. So there's a job for you, Sheldon.
Little boys don't think of themselves as Prince Charming?
I don't think so.
I'd rather have them identify with Cinderella. Actually, there were male Cinderella stories, a wonderfully rich tradition that has disappeared. And I'm willing to bet that there must have been a male Little Red Riding Hood as well. You know, a kid who managed to survive the threat from the wolf. So, you know, we should reinvent some of those stories for precisely the reasons you mentioned.
Well, the way, the place that it could be done, not so much for very young children, but older boys, and I think they're a large audience for the Harry Potter story, is to make Harry Potter. See, I have only read the first book, so I'm not sure how emotional or how much the J.K. Rowling gets into the inner life of Harry Potter. I don't think that much.
Nor am I, really.
Right. I don't think she does that much, but that
to
would
some extent.
But that would be an opportunity to get male readers into a more feeling mode.
Well, and if you think about it, Maurice Sendak's picture books, many of them have male protagonists. Think of Mickey in the Night Kitchen, and Max, Where the Wild Things Are. He has become a part of our folklore. And he's certainly a character who uses fantasy to repair his damaged relationship with his mother. So it's an interesting
And that's a pretty
twist on
scary
fairy
story
tale.
in a way.
Yes, all those monsters.
Right, but so many children have read it and survived, you know, and I think they've gotten something, you know, the kinds of things.
But is that our goal, to survive?
No, not to survive. I think Maria touched on the notion of reparation. I mean, here's a child whose relationship with his mother breaks down over food, and he goes, in a way, the story allows a child to empathize because the creatures in the story threaten him just, you know, as he threatened his mother. He said, I'm going to eat you or something, and now they're going to eat him. So the child, in reading that, gets I think, incorporates something having to do with empathy, and the story then becomes a positive thing, even though it has these scary elements. Those are very scary creatures that Sendak draws.
Children have to deal with scary emotions on a daily basis, with anger, fear, fear of abandonment. And this story sort of says, you can manage, maybe you can't master those anxieties, but at least you can manage them. You can tame them, just as Max tames the monsters.
You know, when I was growing up, if I didn't have to deal with Hansel and Gretel and monsters and so forth until such time as I got to Dr. Larson, I wouldn't still be going to bed with a nightlight on. I mean, there is that other side.
But it's not so bad to go to bed with a nightlight. It's not the worst thing in the world.
But I shouldn't have to. Is my point.
But you know, we're talking about fairy tales as having bad elements and negative implications. And if you would talk about changing them, I would talk about changing or banning magazines like Vogue and Cosmopolitan and these magazines that kind of send really pernicious messages to young girls. And I think that's
those are the really scary
those
stories.
are scary stuff, not the fairy tales.
You know, I remember there's a joke about the kid who whose parents banned fairy tales from his life, and at the age of 10, he runs into his parents' bedroom and says, "Mom, Dad, there's a complex hiding under my bed." So in a way, maybe those monsters are better than the complexes, you know, or at least they have bodies and
It's
shapes.
certainly more real.
Yeah.
How should a parent respond when a child asks their parent if the fairy tale is true?
With the truth. The answer is no. This is a story. That stories are interesting and they have meaning and they can teach us things. That's enough.
And that's the great thing about the line, once upon a time.
Exactly.
It demarcates reality from fantasy. This is a story that I'm going to tell you, and we'll talk about it too. But it's not real.
And children are able to separate that fiction from their own reality?
Absolutely.
As they grow older, I think that they are. I think that children, I was just going to say, I think children have and then will learn a capacity of immersion. They immerse themselves in a fantasy, in a story, and then when the story's over, they pull out of it. That after a child reads Where the Wild Things Are, he doesn't think that those creatures are surrounding him. And it's the same thing with adults. We go into a movie or we read a book, and for the time we're in it, we're totally immersed, and the movie is a reality for us. You know, otherwise we wouldn't get emotional when we see all the things on the screen. But as soon as we leave the theater, we're able to realize that was a movie, that was an event. And I think children learn that there are stories, there are fairy tales or stories in general, that in a way is another world. It's a wonder world, but it isn't not the world that they encounter when they go to school or they have to deal with their parents and so on. So I think children do know that difference.
There are some children, and they're few that you do see, however, for whom these characters can become extraordinarily real. And that, however, is a unique child. I think most parents are clever in being able to determine when that child may have had too much. I know there's one of the mothers felt, as you pointed out, when she saw how her child reacted, she pulled back from that particular episode.
Is a rich fantasy life a good thing?
It's a wonderful thing. It's a gift, a joy.
What role does magic play in the life of children? I think it's especially true of boys. Boys like magic. Why is that?
Not just boys?
I don't think there's any sex difference.
I don't think there is either. I think magic is...
Boys still always go into those toy and game shops. So you give a boy $10, you give a girl $10, the girl comes out with a doll, the boy comes out with the magic book and the magic games. I mean, that's been my experience. I hope that's changed.
Well, boys also come out with the guns and G.I. Joe also.
I rest my case.
Well, I think there's a difference between magic and magical thinking. That is, I want to endorse this notion of magic and empowering the child, allowing the child to use the imagination. But there is a little bit of the risk of magical thinking, that if you start to wish the things that happen in fairy tales, they will, after all, there's stories in which people do get 3 wishes, and the fantasy is fulfilled as soon as the words are said. I was thinking of flying, the desire to fly, how children all want that fantasy to come true, and there it is in Peter Pan for all of them.
Don't we all want magic in our own lives? When talking about kids, I think we want to think there's something. I mean, we know we worry about money and about health and how the kids will be and so on. I think we need fantasy. We need the kind of magic that kind of detaches from the day-to-day trials of life, and I think that it's and I think it's empowering psychologically for people to have fantasy and to have magic.
See, I guess I'm the type of person that thinks this is reality. You ought to learn how to live in it.
But you're a lawyer.
Don't condemn me for that, please. How is it that fairy tales have been passed down from generation to generation to generation? They seem ever enduring. I
think it's because they have something valuable to give children. And if they, well, first of all, they're exciting. They're adventure stories, and children and adults like adventure and mystery and suspense and so on. But there are a lot of stories that have those components. I think that that the stories have contributed something psychological to children, and it makes it very valuable to them. They're kind of developmental aids, if you will. They help children grow. They help children deal with their own impulses, their own fantasies, and it's because of that, I think, that they have this enduring quality.
To me, I see them as so intensely involved with the family. In the end, they lived happily ever after with marriage. But in fact, the stories are never about marriage and romance. I mean, there are a few like Bluebeard, but they're really adult tales. But these are so powerful because they deal with these daily issues: sibling rivalry, maternal conflicts, jealousy, sexual rivalry with mothers or stepmothers, cannibalism, fear of being devoured, fear of being abandoned, all those raw emotions that the children have within them and that need to be worked through.
Yeah. And I think the quote sins that I talk about in my book, the issues of greed and jealousy and deceit and so on, I think their importance is that they act to cement human relationships.
And I have to interrupt you because we are out of time. I'm sorry about that. You've been a delightful panel. Thank you so much for joining me here this afternoon. And before we close, I'd like us to all take a look at some children's reaction to the big bad wolf in some fairy tales. So thank you for joining me. Until next time, be well.
Hansel and Gretel never guessed that woman who seemed to be so nice was truly very wicked. She had built her house out of cakes and candies just to attract children so she could eat them for dinner. The old woman dragged Hansel to a wooden cage. Then she woke up Gretel.
It was not long before the wolf came along. He knocked on the door saying, little pig, let me come in, not by the hair on my chinny chin, but said the second little pig. Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in.
Dad, where are you going?
I'm gonna go play a little golf.
Why?
Because it's Saturday, and that's the day that Dad plays golf.
Why?
Because I really like golf.
But why?
Well, good question. Because most of the time I just spend the day chasing a little white ball around the course.
Why?
Well, usually it's because I hit the ball into the rough or out of bounds.
Why?
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder why I even took up this game. Maybe I'll cut back a little.
Why?
Well, for starters, maybe I could spend a few more Saturdays doing something with you.
Hey, Dad?
Huh?
When?
Family. Isn't it about time? From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
What inspired David to spend a lifetime exploring distant planets?
Star Trek.
What inspired Nicole to bring new life into the world?
The first time I saw St. Elsewhere.
And what inspired Stephen to risk his life for others?
Hill Street Blues.
Television. Who will it inspire next?
You know how inquisitive kids are. That's why you store sharp objects in a safe place. Keep medicines out of reach. And if you have a gun, you keep it unloaded and locked away. As concerned members of the television community, we urge you to be just as careful with television. Kids don't always know what they're watching. That's why you should.
Mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all? The mirror replied, you, my queen, may lovely be, but Snow White is fairer still than thee. The queen was very angry. She could not stand to have anybody be prettier than herself. She called the woodsman and ordered him to take Snow White away and to kill her. The man, fearing for his own life, took the girl deep into the forest, but could not bring himself to carry out the order. Instead, he left Snow White there alone. Snow White had never been all by herself in the woods before. Around her were strange noises and scary shadows. She was so scared that she began to run. Tree branches caught in her black hair as she ran through the forest. Snow White ran as